The horse beneath him was dying. Maverick Xavier knew that with the same certainty that he knew his own name, but he drove the animal forward anyway, because 3 days ago he had seen smoke rising from the valley where no smoke should be, and he had not been able to shake the feeling that someone needed help. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the sun when he dismounted, muscles honed from years of trapping in the mountains of Wyoming rippling beneath his buckskin shirt, as he gave the exhausted animal what little water remained in his canteen. His dark hair hung past his collar, tangled from the wind and the relentless pace, and his jaw was set in a line of pure determination that had gotten him through blizzards and bear attacks and loneliness that could drive a weaker man to madness. It was September of 1878, and the autumn air carried the first hints of the brutal winter that would soon descend on these mountains. Maverick had spent the last 8 years in these peaks, learning every canyon and every creek, building a reputation among the few trappers and traders who crossed his path as a man who could survive anything. He was 26 years old and had not spoken to another human being for nearly 4 months when he saw that smoke, and something in his gut told him to ride toward it instead of away. The smoke had come from the eastern slope of the mountain range, a full day's hard ride from his cabin, and by the time he reached the place where he thought he had seen it, there was nothing but ash and the scattered remains of what looked like a small wagon. The wood was charred beyond recognition, and there were tracks everywhere, unshod ponies mixed with the deeper prints of iron-shod horses. Raiders, probably, or a war party, though the Sioux and Cheyenne had been pushed north and east years ago. Maverick had knelt in the dirt, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he sifted through the debris, looking for bodies or clues or anything that might tell him what had happened here. He found a scrap of blue fabric, fine cotton that had no business being out here in the wilderness, and a broken trunk that had once held women's things, combs and ribbons, and a small leather-bound book with pages so badly burned he could not read them. There had been at least one woman here, maybe more, and the tracks led away to the east, toward the ravines and canyons that cut through the landscape like scars. Some of the tracks were clear, purposeful, the raiders or whoever they were moving with confidence, but there were other marks too, scuff marks and disturbed stones that suggested someone had fled in a different direction. Maverick had stood there in the fading light of that first day, his decision already made before he consciously thought it through. He could not leave someone out here to die. It went against everything in him, against the code he had learned from his father and the mountain men who had taught him to survive. So he had climbed back on his horse and followed the fainter trail, the one that suggested flight and fear, and he had been riding ever since. The second day had been worse than the first. The trail disappeared for hours at a time, forcing him to backtrack and search and use every skill he had ever learned about tracking. He found a torn piece of skirt caught on a juniper bush, so he knew he was following a woman, and the thought of her out here alone, fleeing from whatever had destroyed that wagon, made something fierce and protective rise in his chest. He did not know her, had never seen her, but she was in danger, and that was enough. By the third day, his horse was stumbling, and Maverick himself was swaying in the saddle, exhaustion pulling at him like a physical weight. He had not slept, had barely eaten, consuming nothing but jerky and water as he pushed forward. The trail had led him into a section of the mountains he knew less well, where the ravines were deeper and the rocks were unstable, and he should have been more careful, should have slowed down, but the urgency in his gut would not let him rest. He found the ravine just as the sun was beginning to set on that third day. It was a deep gash in the earth, maybe 30 feet from top to bottom, with steep sides covered in loose scree and stubborn brush. Maverick dismounted and moved to the edge, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, his voice rough from disuse echoing off the canyon walls. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind and the faint cry of a hawk somewhere overhead. Then he heard it, a voice so faint he almost missed it, a woman's voice calling back to him from somewhere below. Maverick dropped to his stomach and crawled to the very edge of the ravine, peering down into the shadows, and there she was. She was huddled against the far wall of the ravine, her dress torn and filthy, her hair a dark tangle around her shoulders. Even from this distance he could see that she was hurt, one leg stretched out at an awkward angle, but she was alive, and she was looking up at him with eyes that held both hope and terror. Maverick felt something shift in his chest, something he had not felt in years, a connection that went beyond simple human compassion. "I am going to get you out of there," he called down to her, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. He was already assessing the ravine, looking for the safest way down, calculating angles and risks with the practiced eye of a man who had climbed mountains since he was old enough to walk. "Please hurry," she called back, and her voice cracked on the words, thick with pain and exhaustion and relief. "I have been here for 2 days. 2 days at the bottom of a ravine with what looked like a broken leg, possibly broken ribs, definitely dehydration and exposure." Maverick did not waste time with more words. He went back to his horse and pulled his rope from the saddle, along with what remained of his supplies. The horse was finished, standing with its head down and its sides heaving, and Maverick felt a stab of guilt for what he had put the animal through. But there would be time for guilt later. Right now, he had to get to the woman at the bottom of that ravine. He found a sturdy juniper growing near the edge and tested it with his full weight, pulling and jerking until he was satisfied it would hold. Then he secured one end of the rope and tossed the other end down into the ravine, watching as it uncoiled and fell, landing a few feet from where the woman sat. The climb down was treacherous, the rope rough against his palms even through the calluses, the rock face crumbling under his boots. But Maverick had done harder climbs in worse conditions, and he made it to the bottom without incident. Up close, she was even more battered than he had thought. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut. There were cuts and scrapes covering every visible inch of her skin. Her dress had once been a beautiful thing, he could tell, the kind of dress a woman wore for traveling in civilized places, but now it was little more than rags held together by stubborn stitching. She was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read, part gratitude and part wariness, and he realized with a start that she was probably terrified of him. He was a big man. He knew that. 6 feet 3 inches of solid muscle earned through hard labor and harder living. His face was hidden behind weeks of beard growth, and he probably looked more like a bear than a man, especially after 3 days without rest. He held up his hands in what he hoped was a calming gesture and spoke in the gentlest voice he could manage. "My name is Maverick Xavier," he said. "I saw the smoke from your wagon 3 days ago, and I have been tracking you since. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to get you out of here and somewhere safe." She studied him for a long moment, those eyes searching his face for any sign of deception, and then she nodded slowly. "My name is Nora Preston," she said, and her voice was softer now, less afraid. "Thank you for coming. I thought I was going to die down here." Maverick moved closer, dropping to a crouch beside her so he could examine her injuries without looming over her. "Where are you hurt?" he asked, though he could already see some of it. "My leg," Nora said, gesturing to the one stretched out in front of her. "I think it is broken, and my ribs on this side. It hurts to breathe, and my head, I hit it when I fell, but I do not think it is serious." Maverick gently probed the leg, feeling along the bone through her torn skirt, and he felt her tense under his touch. The break was clean, he thought, probably the tibia, and it had not broken through the skin, which was a blessing. The ribs were harder to assess without removing her dress, which he was not about to do, but from the way she was breathing in short, shallow gasps, he would bet at least 2 were cracked or broken. "I'm going to splint the leg," he told her, sitting back on his heels. "And then I'm going to carry you out of here. It is going to hurt. I will not lie to you about that, but I will be as careful as I can." Nora nodded, her jaw set in a way that told him she was tougher than she looked. "Do what you have to do," she said. Maverick went to work with the efficiency of long practice. He found 2 relatively straight pieces of wood among the debris at the bottom of the ravine, and used strips torn from his own shirt to bind them to her leg, immobilizing it as best he could. Nora did not cry out, though he saw tears streaming down her face, and he found himself respecting her more with every passing moment. When the splint was secure, he gave her what water he had left and a piece of jerky, watching as she consumed both with desperate hunger. "What happened to your wagon?" he asked as she ate, partly to distract her and partly because he genuinely wanted to know. Nora swallowed hard and looked away. "We were traveling to Lusk, Wyoming," she said. "My father and I. He had business there, something to do with a mine I never fully understood. We hired a guide and 2 men for protection, But 3 days ago we were attacked. I think it was outlaws, not Indians, though I cannot be certain. They killed everyone." Her voice broke on the last word, and Maverick saw fresh tears spill down her cheeks. "Everyone?" he asked gently. "My father, the guide, the 2 guards. They shot them all, and then they set fire to the wagon. I managed to run while they were distracted, but they chased me. I fell into this ravine trying to get away, and I think they assumed I was dead because they stopped searching." Maverick felt anger rise in him, hot and fierce, at the thought of men who would kill for whatever paltry belongings a single wagon might hold. "How old are you?" he asked, because she looked young, though it was hard to tell through the bruises in the dirt. 22, Nora said, lifting her chin slightly as if daring him to comment on her youth. "Old enough to know that I should be dead right now, and that you saved my life." "We are not out of this yet," Maverick said, though her age was a relief. He had been afraid she might be younger, a child fleeing tragedy, but she was a woman grown, capable of understanding the dangers they still faced. "Getting you up that rope is going to be the hardest part. I'm going to have to carry you." He did not give her time to protest or prepare. He simply scooped her up in his arms, trying to ignore the way she gasped in pain, and positioned her so that her injured leg was supported and her head could rest against his shoulder. She was lighter than he expected, probably from 2 days without food or water, and he could feel every bone in her body through the thin fabric of her dress. It made him angry all over again, this fragile woman thrown into danger through no fault of her own. The climb up was brutal. Maverick had to use one hand to grip the rope while the other supported Nora, his legs doing most of the work as he found footholds in the crumbling rock face. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, exhaustion, and 3 days without rest catching up to him all at once, but he did not stop. He could not stop. Nora had buried her face against his neck, and he could feel her tears soaking into his shirt, could feel the tremors that ran through her body with every jarring movement, but she did not make a sound, and that silence gave him the strength to keep climbing. When they reached the top, Maverick pulled them both over the edge and lay there for a moment, Nora still cradled against his chest, both of them breathing hard. The sun had set while they were in the ravine, and the sky above was painted in shades of purple and orange, beautiful and indifferent to the suffering below. Maverick felt Nora stir against him, and he reluctantly set her down, propping her against a rock so she could sit without putting weight on her leg. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Maverick looked at his horse, still standing where he had left it, and knew the animal would not make it another mile, let alone the day's journey back to his cabin. He looked at the sky, at the rapidly fading light, and made a decision. "We camp here tonight," he said. "My horse is done, and you need rest. In the morning, I will figure out how to get us back to my cabin." "Your cabin?" Nora asked, and there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. "It is about a day's walk from here," Maverick said, "maybe more given your injuries. But it is the closest shelter and winter is coming. We need to get you somewhere warm and dry, somewhere I can treat your injuries properly." He did not mention that a day's walk for him would be 3 or 4 days for her, not with a broken leg and cracked ribs. He did not mention that they had almost no food or water, or that the temperature would drop below freezing tonight, or that there might still be outlaws in the area looking for survivors. There was no point in frightening her more than she already was. Instead, he set about making camp. He found a sheltered spot among the rocks, out of the wind, and gathered what little dry wood he could find in the fading light. He got a fire going using flint and steel, coaxing the flames to life with the patience of long practice, and then he spread out his bedroll near the fire and helped Nora settle onto it. She protested, saying he needed it more than she did, but he ignored her, wrapping his coat around her shoulders and tucking it in like she was a child. "You are injured," he said firmly when she tried to argue. "You need the warmth more than I do. I have slept in worse conditions than this." Nora looked like she wanted to argue more, but exhaustion was pulling at her. He could see it in the droop of her shoulders and the way her eyes kept drifting closed. Maverick sat down across the fire from her, feeding it carefully to keep the flames steady, and watched as she finally gave in to sleep. Alone with his thoughts, Maverick found himself studying her in the firelight. Even battered and bruised, she was beautiful, with delicate features that spoke of a life lived far from these rough mountains. Her hair was dark, almost black, and it fell in waves around her face when it was not tangled with dirt and leaves. Her hands were small, the nails broken and dirty now, but clearly cared for before this ordeal. She was not built for this life, he thought, not built for hardship and danger and the brutal reality of the frontier. But she had survived 2 days at the bottom of a ravine with serious injuries, and she had not complained once during the climb out, and she had tried to give him his own bedroll even though she was the one who needed it. There was strength in her, a core of steel beneath the delicate exterior, and Maverick found himself drawn to that strength in a way he had not expected. He shook his head, trying to clear those thoughts. She was injured and traumatized and dependent on him for survival. The last thing she needed was him developing inappropriate feelings for her. He was here to help her, to get her somewhere safe, and then she would go on her way to Lusk or wherever she had been heading, and he would go back to his solitary life in the mountains. That was how it had to be. The night was long and cold. Maverick did not sleep, keeping watch over Nora and the fire and the darkness beyond their small circle of light. He heard wolves howling in the distance and the scream of a mountain lion somewhere to the north, but nothing came close to their camp, and he was grateful for that small mercy. Nora woke several times, crying out in pain or fear, and each time Maverick was there, speaking to her in low, soothing tones until she calmed and drifted back to sleep. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, Maverick stood and stretched, feeling every one of his 26 years in the ache of his muscles and the exhaustion that went bone deep. His horse had died during the night, he saw, and he felt a wave of sorrow for the animal that had carried him so far and asked so little in return. He would have to bury it later, but for now there were more pressing concerns. Nora was awake, watching him with eyes that were clearer than they had been the night before. "Your horse," she said softly. "I know," Maverick replied. "He gave everything he had. I will see to him properly when we have time, but right now I need to figure out how to get you to my cabin." He spent the next hour fashioning a travois from branches and rope, a simple triangular frame that he could drag behind him with Nora secured on top. It was not comfortable, he knew that, but it was better than carrying her for days on end, and it would distribute her weight more evenly. When it was finished, he helped her onto it, patting the frame with his bedroll and what was left of her skirts to cushion her as much as possible. "This is going to be rough," he warned her. "I will go as slowly as I can, but we are going to be crossing some difficult terrain." "I trust you," Nora said, and the simple statement hit him harder than it should have. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to put her life in his hands, but she was doing it anyway, and that faith felt like both a gift and a burden. The journey to his cabin took 4 days instead of 1. Maverick pulled the travois through ravines and over ridges, navigating paths that were barely wide enough for him to walk, let alone drag a makeshift sled. They ran out of food on the 2nd day and water on the 3rd, and by the 4th day, both of them were running on willpower alone. Maverick's shoulders were raw from the ropes, and he was pretty sure he had cracked a rib when he slipped on some loose rock and fell, but he did not stop. He could not stop. Nora amazed him. She never complained, not once, even when he knew the jolting of the travois must be agony on her broken leg and ribs. She spoke to him during the journey, telling him stories about her life to distract both of them from the hardship. She had grown up in Philadelphia, she said, in a big house with servants and parties and all the trappings of wealth. Her mother had died when she was 16, and her father had thrown himself into his business, dragging Nora along on increasingly ambitious ventures until this final fatal trip to Wyoming. "I think he was trying to outrun the grief," she said on the 3rd day, her voice drifting back to him as he pulled her through a narrow pass. He could not stand to be in that house without her, could not stand to be reminded of what he had lost, so he kept moving, kept chasing the next opportunity, and I went with him because he was all I had left. "I am sorry," Maverick said, and he meant it. He knew what it was like to lose family, knew the particular ache of being alone in the world. "What about you?" Nora asked. "How did you end up living alone in these mountains?" Maverick was quiet for a moment, debating how much to share. He was not used to talking about himself, was not used to having anyone care enough to ask. But there was something about Nora, something about her openness and her willingness to share her own pain that made him want to reciprocate. "My father was a trapper," he said finally. He brought me out here when I was 12, taught me everything he knew about surviving in the wilderness. My mother had died years before, and it was just the two of us. He died when I was 18, caught in a blizzard while checking his trap lines. I found him 3 days later, frozen solid. He heard Nora's sharp intake of breath but kept talking, the words coming easier now that he had started. I thought about going back east, trying to make a life in the towns, but I did not know how to be around people anymore. The mountains made sense to me in a way that civilization never did. So I stayed, took over my father's cabin, and I have been here ever since. That must be lonely, Nora said softly. It is, Maverick admitted, but it is safe. Out here, the only thing that can hurt you is nature, and at least nature is honest about what it is. They lapsed into silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that came from shared understanding. Maverick found himself thinking about what it would be like to have someone to share his cabin with, someone to talk to during the long winter nights, and he had to remind himself again that Nora was not here by choice. She was here because she had no other options, and as soon as she was well enough to travel, she would leave, and he would be alone again. When they finally reached his cabin on the 4th day, Maverick felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly brought him to his knees. The cabin was a simple structure, built from logs his father had cut and chinked with mud and moss, but it was solid and well-maintained, with a good roof and a stone fireplace that could keep the interior warm even in the depths of winter. He pulled the travois right up to the door and carefully lifted Nora off, carrying her inside and setting her down on the bed that dominated one corner of the single room. The cabin was sparse, furnished with only the essentials: the bed, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies and tools, a trunk for clothes and personal items. There was a bearskin rug on the floor and pelts hanging from the rafters, evidence of Maverick's skill as a trapper. It was a man's space, rough and utilitarian, and Maverick suddenly felt self-conscious about it, wondering what Nora must think of this crude dwelling after a life of luxury in Philadelphia. But Nora was not looking at the cabin with disdain. She was looking at it with relief, her eyes drinking in the solid walls and the promise of shelter. "It is wonderful," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. Maverick got a fire going in the fireplace and heated water in a pot, using some of his precious stores of tea and dried meat to make a weak broth that would be easy on their empty stomachs. He helped Nora sit up enough to drink, supporting her with one arm while holding the cup to her lips with the other, and he tried not to notice how right it felt to care for her like this, how natural. Over the next few weeks, Maverick devoted himself to Nora's recovery. He re-splinted her leg properly, using straight boards and clean strips of cloth, and he bound her ribs to support them while they healed. He made poultices from herbs he had gathered during the summer and applied them to her cuts and bruises, watching as the swelling went down and the wounds began to close. He cooked for her simple meals of venison and rabbit and the vegetables he had stored for the winter, and he watched with satisfaction as color returned to her cheeks and strength returned to her body. Nora was not a passive patient. As soon as she was able, she insisted on helping around the cabin, mending his clothes and organizing his supplies and doing what she could from the bed. Maverick protested at first, telling her she needed to rest, but she fixed him with a stubborn look that reminded him of his mother. "I cannot just lie here and let you wait on me hand and foot," she said. "I need to feel useful, to feel like I am contributing something." So Maverick let her help, and the cabin slowly transformed under her influence. She made curtains from spare fabric, softening the harsh lines of the windows. She organized his chaotic collection of herbs and medicines, labeling jars and arranging them by use. She even convinced him to let her teach him to read better, spending hours each evening going through the few books she had salvaged from her wagon, patient and encouraging as he stumbled through words he had never learned. "My father taught me to read enough to get by," Maverick admitted one night, frustrated with his own slow progress. "But he was not much for books himself, said the mountains were all the education a man needed." "The mountains can teach you how to survive," Nora said, her finger marking their place on the page. "But books can teach you how to live. There is a difference." Maverick thought about that as he watched her read, her voice soft and musical in the firelight, and he realized she was right. He had been surviving for 8 years, existing from one day to the next, but he had not been living. Not really. Not until she arrived and filled his cabin with her presence, her voice, her laughter. Because she did laugh, he discovered, despite everything she had been through. She had a sense of humor that was sharp and unexpected, finding amusement in his rough manners and his awkward attempts at domesticity. She teased him when he burned dinner or when he tried to fold laundry and ended up with a tangled mess, and he found himself laughing with her, genuine laughter that felt rusty from disuse. As the weeks turned into months and autumn gave way to winter, Maverick found himself falling in love. He tried to fight it, tried to tell himself that she was here out of necessity and that any feelings she might develop for him were just gratitude, but it was a losing battle. He loved the way she hummed to herself while she worked, loved the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, loved the way she listened to his stories about the mountains as if they were the most fascinating things she had ever heard. He loved her courage and her kindness and her resilience. He loved the way she had adapted to this harsh life, learning to cook over an open fire and to appreciate the simple pleasures of a warm cabin and a full belly. He loved that she did not complain about the isolation or the rough conditions, that she seemed genuinely happy here with him, away from all the trappings of civilization. And he was terrified that she did not feel the same way, terrified that when spring came and the passes cleared, she would leave and never look back. Nora's leg healed slowly but surely, and by the time the first heavy snows arrived in late November, she was able to walk with the help of a crutch Maverick had carved for her. Her ribs had healed as well, and the bruises and cuts had faded until they were barely visible. She was still thinner than she should have been, but there was color in her cheeks and brightness in her eyes, and Maverick thought she had never looked more beautiful. One night in early December, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Nora set down the book she had been reading and looked at him with an expression he could not quite decipher. "Maverick," she said, and there was something in her voice that made his heart skip. "I need to talk to you about something." Maverick felt his stomach drop. This was it, he thought. She was going to tell him that she wanted to leave, that she was grateful for everything he had done, but she needed to get back to civilization, to the life she had left behind. He braced himself for the words, trying to prepare for the inevitable loneliness that would follow. "I have been thinking a lot about my future," Nora continued, her gaze steady on his, "about what I want my life to look like. Before the attack, I was drifting, following my father from one venture to the next without any real purpose or direction. I was not happy, but I did not know what would make me happy, so I just went along with whatever he decided." She paused, her fingers twisting in her lap, and Maverick wanted to reach out and take her hands in his to comfort her, but he did not dare move. "But these past few months here with you have shown me something," Nora said. "They have shown me that happiness is not about wealth or status or living in a big house with servants. It is about being with someone who sees you for who you really are, who values you not for what you can give them, but for who you are as a person." Maverick's heart was pounding now, hope warring with fear in his chest. "Nora," he started, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish," she said, and there was a tremor in her voice now. "I know that I came here out of necessity, that you saved my life and gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about necessity for me. Somewhere along the way, I started to care for you, Maverick. I started to fall in love with you, with your kindness and your strength and the way you see the world. And I do not want to leave when spring comes. I want to stay here with you if you will have me." For a moment, Maverick could not breathe. He stared at her, at this beautiful, brave woman who had just laid her heart bare, and he felt his own heart swell with so much emotion he thought it might burst. Then he was moving, crossing the space between them in 2 long strides, and he was kneeling in front of her, taking her hands in his much larger ones. "Nora," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I have been in love with you since the moment I pulled you out of that ravine. I've been trying to tell myself that it was impossible, that you would want to go back to your old life, but the truth is I cannot imagine my life without you in it anymore. You have brought light and warmth and joy to this cabin and to my heart, and if you are willing to stay, then I would be honored to have you here. Not as a guest, but as my partner, my wife, if you will have me." Nora's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, and she squeezed his hands so tightly it almost hurt. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will have you." I will marry you and stay with you and build a life with you here in these mountains." Maverick pulled her into his arms, careful of her still healing injuries, and kissed her for the first time. Her lips were soft and warm against his, and she tasted like the tea they had been drinking, and something sweeter, something that was uniquely her. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but it deepened as they both gave in to the feelings they had been holding back, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I love you," Maverick said, resting his forehead against hers. "I love you so much it scares me." "I love you too," Nora whispered, "and I am not scared. Not anymore. Not as long as I have you." They were married on Christmas Day, just the two of them in the cabin with the snow falling softly outside. Maverick had carved a simple ring from a piece of antler, and Nora had fashioned a ring for him from a strip of leather braided with silver thread she had salvaged from her dress. They spoke their vows to each other with no one to witness but the mountains and the sky, and it was the most meaningful ceremony either of them could have imagined. Their wedding night was tender and slow, Maverick treating Nora as if she were made of spun glass, terrified of hurting her or moving too fast. But Nora was not fragile, she reminded him with touches and kisses and whispered encouragement, and when they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like two pieces of a puzzle finally finding their perfect fit. Winter passed in a blur of contentment. They spent long days working together to maintain the cabin and the trap lines, Nora proving herself surprisingly adept at skinning pelts and preserving meat. They spent longer nights wrapped in each other's arms, talking and making love and simply enjoying the warmth of being together. Maverick taught Nora to shoot and to track, and she taught him to appreciate poetry and to find beauty in things he had always taken for granted. When spring arrived and the passes cleared, a trapper named Samuel Morrison stopped by the cabin on his way north. He was surprised to find Maverick with a wife, and even more surprised when Maverick asked him to carry a message to Lusk, informing anyone who might be looking for Nora Preston that she was alive and well and had chosen to remain in the mountains. "You are sure about this?" Samuel asked, looking at Nora with concern. "This is a hard life for a woman, especially one who is used to finer things." "I am very sure," Nora said firmly, moving to stand beside Maverick and taking his hand. "This is exactly where I want to be." Samuel shrugged and agreed to carry the message, and when he left the next morning, Maverick and Nora stood together watching him go, their arms around each other. "No regrets?" Maverick asked softly. "None," Nora said, turning to look up at him. "This is my home now. You are my home." That summer they worked together to expand the cabin, adding a second room that could serve as a nursery when the time came. Maverick also built a small garden plot, tilling the rocky soil and helping Nora plant the seeds she had been carefully hoarding. It was hard work, but satisfying, and they both took pride in watching the tiny green shoots push their way up through the earth. In late August, Nora confirmed what they had both suspected for weeks. She was pregnant. Maverick was terrified and elated in equal measure, overwhelmed by the responsibility of bringing a child into this harsh world, but thrilled at the thought of a family, of children who would carry on after he was gone. Nora was calm and confident, assuring him that women had been having babies for thousands of years and she would be fine. "Besides," she said with a mischievous smile, "you pulled me out of a ravine with a broken leg and got me across miles of wilderness. Surely you can handle one tiny baby." Maverick laughed despite his anxiety and pulled her close, resting his hand on her still flat stomach. "We can handle anything together," he said. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into winter. Nora remained active, helping with the daily chores and the trap lines, until Maverick finally put his foot down and insisted she rest more. They argued about it, Nora insisting she was not fragile, and Maverick insisting he could not bear the thought of anything happening to her or the baby. And eventually they compromised, Nora agreeing to take things easier in exchange for Maverick agreeing to stop hovering over her like an anxious mother hen. Their son was born on a cold March morning in 1880, arriving with the sunrise and a lusty cry that filled the cabin with sound. Maverick delivered the baby himself, his hands shaking but steady as he guided the infant into the world and placed him on Nora's chest. She was exhausted and beautiful, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, and she looked at their son with so much love that Maverick felt his eyes sting with tears. "He is perfect," Nora whispered, running her fingers over the baby's tiny head, the soft dark hair that was already showing signs of curl. He is, Maverick agreed, awed by the small miracle they had created. What should we name him? They had discussed names for months, but now that the baby was here, all of those carefully chosen options seemed inadequate. Nora was quiet for a moment, studying their son's face, and then she smiled. Matthew, she said. Matthew Joseph Xavier, after both our fathers. Maverick felt his throat tighten. He had never told Nora his father's middle name, had barely thought of it himself in years, but somehow she had known, had understood that honoring the men who had shaped them was important. Matthew, he repeated, testing the name. I like it. Matthew was a healthy, happy baby, and he transformed their lives in ways they could never have anticipated. Maverick discovered reserves of patience he had not known he possessed, spending hours rocking his son to sleep or making funny faces to coax out a smile. Nora bloomed in motherhood, her already considerable strength and resilience deepened by the fierce protectiveness she felt for their child. They were not alone for long. In the spring of 1881, Samuel Morrison stopped by again, and this time he brought news. Several families were moving into the area, homesteaders looking to claim land and build a community. A small settlement was growing near Lusk, he said, and there was talk of building a school and a church. Maverick and Nora listened to this news with mixed feelings. Part of them valued the isolation they had found in the mountains, but another part, especially with Matthew growing bigger every day, recognized the potential benefits of having neighbors, of being part of a community. They decided to venture down to Lusk that summer, to see the changes for themselves and to decide if they wanted to be part of them. The town had indeed grown since the attack on Nora's wagon 3 years earlier. There were new buildings, including a general store and a small hotel, and the people they met were friendly and welcoming. They were particularly intrigued when they learned Nora's story, the tale of the Philadelphia heiress who had survived an outlaw attack and chosen to stay in the mountains with the man who had rescued her. You are something of a legend, the storekeeper told them, grinning. People have been telling stories about the mountain man who rode 3 days without rest to save a woman he had never met. Some folks did not believe it was true. Maverick was uncomfortable with the attention, but Nora squeezed his hand and smiled at the storekeeper. It is true, she said, and I am grateful every day that he did not give up on me. They returned to the cabin with supplies and a promise to visit Lusk more regularly, to be part of the growing community while still maintaining their mountain home. It was a good compromise, allowing them to retain the life they loved while also giving Matthew the opportunity to grow up with other children, to learn and socialize and become part of something larger than just the three of them. Nora became pregnant again in the fall of 1882, and their daughter, Naomi Grace Xavier, was born the following summer. She had Nora's dark hair and delicate features, but Maverick's bright blue eyes, and from the moment she entered the world, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. Maverick was even more protective of Naomi than he'd been of Matthew, hovering over her like a bear with a cub, and Nora had to frequently remind him that their daughter needed room to grow and explore. As the years passed, their family grew and flourished. They had 2 more children, a son named Marcus in 1885, and another daughter, Nina, in 1888. The cabin expanded to accommodate them all, growing from a simple one-room structure to a sprawling home with multiple bedrooms and a large main room where they gathered for meals and storytelling. Maverick proved to be a devoted father, teaching his sons to trap and hunt and survive in the wilderness, while also encouraging them to pursue education and learning. He taught his daughters the same skills, much to the surprise of some of their neighbors. But Nora supported him completely, pointing out that her own ability to survive in the mountains had likely saved her life. Nora became a pillar of the growing community around Lusk. She helped establish a school, using her education and her natural gift for teaching to ensure that all the children in the area had access to learning. She also started a lending library, donating her own books and encouraging others to do the same, and she organized community gatherings where families could come together to share food and stories and support. But despite their involvement in the community, the mountains remained their true home. They never moved to town, preferring the peace and beauty of their cabin to the bustle of civilization. Their children grew up wild and free, learning to read the weather and the land, to respect nature's power while also appreciating its beauty. Matthew grew into a tall, strong young man much like his father, with a passion for the mountains and a natural talent for leadership. When he was 18, he announced his intention to become a guide, leading hunting and exploration parties through the wilderness, and both Maverick and Nora supported his choice, proud of the man he had become. Naomi was more interested in medicine, fascinated by the herbs and remedies her father used to treat injuries and illness. She spent hours learning from him and from the doctor who had eventually settled in Lusk, and she talked about becoming a nurse or even a doctor herself, a radical ambition for a young woman in the 1890s, but one that her parents encouraged wholeheartedly. Marcus had his mother's love of books and learning, and he dreamed of becoming a teacher or writer, wanting to document the stories and history of the mountain people. Nina, the youngest, was still finding her path, but she showed signs of inheriting her mother's organizational skills and her father's protective nature, and both parents knew she would do something remarkable with her life. On a warm summer evening in 1895, Maverick and Nora sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset over the mountains. Their children were all inside, the sounds of their laughter and conversation drifting out through the open windows, and Maverick felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if I had not found you that day?" he asked Nora, reaching over to take her hand. Nora was quiet for a moment, considering the question. She was 40 years old now, her dark hair threaded with silver, her face marked by laugh lines, and the gentle weathering of years spent in the sun and wind. But to Maverick, she was as beautiful as she had been at 22. Maybe more so because now he knew every facet of her, every strength and vulnerability and quirk that made her who she was. "I do not think about it," Nora said finally, "because that life, the one where you did not find me, is not real. This is real. You and me and our children and this life we have built together. Everything that came before was just prologue, leading me to exactly where I was supposed to be." "At the bottom of a ravine," Maverick said with a slight smile. "At the bottom of a ravine where a stubborn mountain man would ride 3 days without rest to save me," Nora corrected, squeezing his hand. "I was at my lowest point, broken and afraid and certain I was going to die, and you came for me. You did not know me, had no reason to help me, but you came anyway. And in doing so, you did not just save my life, Maverick. You gave me a life worth living." Maverick felt his eyes sting with tears, even after all these years, still moved by her words, by the depth of feeling in her voice. "You gave me the same thing," he said quietly. "Before you, I was just existing, surviving from one day to the next. You taught me how to live, how to love, how to be part of something bigger than myself." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands clasped, watching as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Inside, their children had started a game of some sort, and the cabin rang with shouts and laughter. Maverick thought about all the years that had passed since that desperate ride through the mountains, all the challenges they had faced and overcome together, and he was grateful for every single moment. "I love you," he said, turning to look at Nora. "After 17 years, 4 children, and countless adventures, I love you more than I did the day we married." "Only 17 years?" Nora said with a teasing smile. "I thought it had been at least 50, given how much you complain about your aching back." Maverick laughed and pulled her close, kissing her with the ease of long familiarity. "My back only aches because I have been keeping up with you and our wild children," he said. "If you would all just slow down occasionally, I would be fine." "Never," Nora said, resting her head on his shoulder. "We have too much living to do to slow down now." And they did live, fully and joyfully, surrounded by the mountains they both loved and the family they had created together. Maverick continued to trap and guide, his reputation spreading throughout Wyoming as a man who knew the mountains better than anyone alive. Nora continued her work with the school and the library, touching countless lives with her generosity and wisdom. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, their children grew and left to pursue their own dreams, but they always came back to the cabin in the mountains, bringing grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren to meet the legendary couple who had built such an extraordinary life together. Matthew became one of the most sought-after guides in the West, known for his skill and his integrity. He married a rancher's daughter named Margaret, and had 5 children of his own. Naomi did indeed become a doctor, one of the first women to practice medicine in Wyoming, and she dedicated her life to serving the rural communities scattered throughout the mountains. Marcus wrote several books about frontier life that became minor classics, preserving the stories and traditions of a vanishing way of life. Nina married a homesteader and raised a family on the plains, but she visited the cabin often, drawn back to the mountains that had shaped her childhood. Through it all, Maverick and Nora remained at the heart of their growing family, the anchor that held them all together. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, mourned losses, and rejoiced in triumphs. They watched the world change around them, electricity and automobiles and all manner of modern conveniences encroaching on the wilderness. But in their cabin, life remained much as it had always been, simple and rooted in the rhythms of nature. On a cold winter morning in 1920, Nora woke to find Maverick already up, stoking the fire in the main room of the cabin. She joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the chill, and together they watched the flames catch and grow. 62 years old and you still refuse to sleep past dawn, Nora said fondly. She was 63 herself now, her hair completely white, her movements slower than they had once been, but still sure and steady. Old habits, Maverick said, wrapping his arm around her waist. His hair was white as well, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were still the same bright blue, still full of the warmth and humor that had first attracted her all those years ago. Besides, I like watching you sleep. You snore, did you know that? I do not snore, Nora protested, elbowing him gently. You are the one who sounds like a bear in hibernation. They bickered good-naturedly as they prepared breakfast, moving around each other with the ease of long practice. The cabin was quiet, just the two of them now, though it would soon fill with family for the Christmas holiday. All 4 of their children were coming, bringing their own families, and the cabin would burst at the seams with love and laughter and the chaos of multiple generations under one roof. Do you ever regret it? Maverick asked as they sat down to eat. Staying here, I mean. Living such a simple life when you could have had so much more. Nora looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the face she knew better than her own, the hands that had held her through joy and sorrow, the eyes that still looked at her with wonder even after 42 years of marriage. I have everything I could ever want, she said simply. I have you, I have our children and grandchildren. I have a life filled with purpose and meaning. What more could there possibly be? Maverick smiled, reaching across the table to take her hand. I ask you that same question at least once a year, and you always give me the same answer. One of these days I am going to believe you. You better believe me, Nora said, because it is the truth, and you know I do not lie to you. They finished their breakfast and went about their daily chores, tasks they had performed thousands of times before, but which never felt burdensome because they did them together. Maverick brought in wood and checked the trap lines close to the cabin, while Nora baked bread and prepared food for the coming holiday. They worked in companionable silence, occasionally pausing to exchange a word or a touch, anchored by the simple presence of each other. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Nora reached for the old leather-bound journal she kept, the one where she had been recording their life together for over 4 decades. She opened to a fresh page and began to write, her handwriting still elegant despite the arthritis that had begun to stiffen her fingers. "What are you writing?" Maverick asked, looking up from the harness he was mending. "Our story," Nora said. "I want our grandchildren to know how we met, how we fell in love, how we built this life. I want them to understand that love is not just about grand gestures and dramatic moments. It is about choosing each other every single day, through good times and bad, through joy and sorrow. It is about riding 3 days without rest to save someone you have never met, and then spending the rest of your life making sure they never regret being saved." Maverick set down the harness and moved to sit beside her, reading over her shoulder. She had written about that desperate ride through the mountains, about the moment he found her at the bottom of the ravine, about the long journey back to the cabin, and the slow, tentative building of trust and then love. She had written about their wedding and the birth of their children, about the challenges they had faced and the victories they had celebrated. "You make it sound like a fairy tale," Maverick said softly. It is a fairy tale," Nora replied, "just one that is true. We got our happily ever after, Maverick. Not everyone does, but we did. And I think that is worth recording, worth remembering, worth sharing with the people who come after us. Maverick kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her soap and wood smoke and something indefinably Nora. "I love you," he said. "Thank you for saying yes all those years ago, for choosing this life with me when you could have chosen so many other paths." "There were no other paths," Nora said, setting down her pen and turning to face him. "There was only this one, the one that led me to you. Everything else was just noise." They sat together by the fire, Maverick's arm around Nora's shoulders, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the mountains in white. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cabin that had been their home for so long. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and new challenges. Maverick and Nora grew older together, their bodies weakening, but their love never wavering. They supported each other through illness and loss, celebrating when great-grandchildren were born and mourning when friends and family members passed away. In the summer of 1928, on a warm July afternoon, Maverick took Nora's hand and led her outside to the porch they had built together 50 years earlier. They sat in their rocking chairs, the ones their son Matthew had made for them as a gift, and looked out at the mountains that had been the backdrop for their entire life together. 70 years old, Maverick said, shaking his head in wonder. "When I was pulling that travois through the wilderness, convinced we were both going to die, I never imagined I would make it to 70. "We have been blessed," Nora said, and at 71, she was still beautiful to him, still the woman who had captured his heart in a ravine all those years ago. "We have had a long, full life together, and we have so much to be grateful for." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its descent behind the peaks. Their family was scattered across Wyoming and beyond now, but they stayed in touch through letters and visits, and the cabin remained the heart of the Xavier clan, the place where everyone gathered for holidays and celebrations. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night after I found you?" Maverick asked suddenly. "You said you thought you were going to die at the bottom of that ravine." "I do remember," Nora said, "and I would have, if not for you." "But you did not die," Maverick said. "You lived. We lived. And we built something beautiful together, something that will last long after we are gone. Our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, they all carry a piece of us forward into the future." "That is our legacy," Nora agreed. "Not wealth or status or any of the things I was supposed to value growing up, but love. Love and family and the knowledge that we mattered to each other and to the people whose lives we touched." As the sun set and the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Maverick and Nora remained on the porch, hands clasped, hearts full. They had been given a gift, they both knew that, a second chance at life and love that many people never received. They had taken that gift and cherished it, nurtured it, built upon it until it became something magnificent. The story of the mountain man who rode 3 days without rest to save a woman he had never met became legend in Wyoming, told and retold with embellishments and elaborations. But for Maverick and Nora, it was simply the beginning of their story, the opening chapter in a life filled with adventure and hardship and joy and, above all, love. They lived for several more years, growing old together in the cabin they had shared for so long. Maverick passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1932, at the age of 74, with Nora holding his hand and their children gathered around him. His last words were for her, a simple statement of love that made her smile even through her tears. Nora followed him 6 months later, unable to bear the separation for long. She died on a summer morning much like the one when they had first declared their love for each other, surrounded by family, her journal open on the table beside her bed to the final entry she had written the night before. "Today I will join my beloved Maverick," it read in her still elegant hand. "He has been waiting for me, I know, because he never could stand to be apart from me for long. Our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren believe I am sad to leave this world, but they are wrong. I am joyful, because I am going to be reunited with the man who saved my life and then made that life worth living. We had 54 years together, and it was not nearly enough, but it was also more than I ever dreamed possible. Thank you, my love, for riding 3 days without rest. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for choosing me every single day until your very last breath. I will see you soon." They were buried together on a hillside overlooking their cabin, the mountains they both loved rising behind them. Their children erected a simple stone marker that read, "Maverick Xavier and Nora Xavier, beloved parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, together in life, together in death, together always." The cabin remained in the Xavier family for generations, preserved as a reminder of the love story that had begun there and the family that had grown from it. Descendants would visit, walking the same paths Maverick and Nora had walked, sitting on the same porch where they had shared so many sunsets, reading Nora's journals and marveling at the extraordinary life their ancestors had built from such a desperate beginning. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the pine trees and the stars shone bright above the mountains, some swore they could hear laughter echoing from the cabin, the sound of two souls who had found each other against all odds and had refused to let go, even in death. It was a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of courage and compassion and the willingness to ride 3 days without rest to save someone who needed saving. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the hardships they had endured or the obstacles they had overcome, but the simple fact that they had found each other and chosen each other and loved each other with a devotion that transcended time and circumstance. They had started with nothing but determination and hope, and they had built a legacy that would last for generations, a reminder that true love, the kind that changes lives and shapes destinies, is worth any sacrifice, any struggle, any 3-day ride through the wilderness. Their story became part of the fabric of Wyoming history, told by parents to children, by grandparents to grandchildren, a tale of heroism and romance that never lost its power to move and inspire. The mountain man who rode 3 days without rest and the woman he found alive at the bottom of a ravine became symbols of perseverance and love, proof that even in the harshest circumstances, beauty and joy could flourish. And somewhere, in a place beyond the mountains and the stars, Maverick and Nora Xavier continued their journey together, hand in hand, heart to heart, forever bound by the love that had defined their lives and would define them for all eternity. They had gotten there happily ever after, earned through sacrifice and struggle and unwavering devotion, and it was more beautiful than any fairy tale because it was real, it had happened, and it would never be forgotten.